A delicate disposition. It's an accident. Sort of. Rayla will swear on her life that she's never once missed her tea, but she's been throwing up for weeks now, and she hasn't had a bleed in longer still. There's no denying it. The proof is there. But in spite of the nausea, and the moodiness, and every other symptom that screams the truth, there's a part of her that doesn't want to believe it, not because she's not ready, she's not, but what can she do, and not because she doesn't want it, she does, even if she does find it hard to admit, but because she doesn't like the idea of being vulnerable, and there's nothing more vulnerable than being, she takes a breath, pregnant. So she pretends she's not vulnerable, she means. It's hard to pretend she's not pregnant when her entire body knows it, but she can still pretend she's not vulnerable and that those other symptoms, the ones that haven't yet started, won't happen to her. Maybe she's right. Maybe they won't. She's not. They do. The first time it happens, Rayla's not ultra prepared for it. She'd known in her head, of course, that things like this were likely to happen, but for the most part, she'd sort of brushed it off as unlikely to happen to her. She's hardly the emotional type, after all, and yeah, things have made her cry in the past, but things were also considerably more serious then. They've enjoyed 4 years of relative peace now, and she and Callum have been married a week. There've been no snide remarks, no poorly disguised digs at elves from humans or vice versa, not even a hint of disrespect from the lesser families or the castle guards. There's not even a meeting they have to rush away for once, and it's been smoother sailing than she ever thought possible. Except for the nausea, of course, but the healer in Lantha had said that that's pretty par for the course. It's still supposed to be a secret. They still haven't told anyone yet, and the ones that do know only know because they'd figured it out. Honestly, it's still pretty ridiculous sounding to Rayla, and she's the one who's been throwing up 4 times a day for 3 weeks. She's spent a pretty solid portion of their married life so far curled up in bed or on the bathroom floor, mug of ginger tea between her palms to still the spinning room and to wash the taste of bile out of her throat, avoiding anyone and everyone in case they figure it out too. But it all comes to a head one morning when Callum comes back from breakfast with a tray of plain toast and fruit juice and a gentle sort of understanding in his eyes. Still not keeping anything down, huh, he says. Rayla groans. She's got her head buried in her arms by the toilet again and her stomach turns at the thought of food, but moon and stars, she has to eat something. It can't be good for her, and it certainly can't be good for, she steels herself for the thought, the baby. She hears Callum sigh, and his fingers are gentle when he pulls her hair back from her face. He presses a kiss into the top of her head and settles behind her, one hand idle against her still flat belly. It'll pass, he promises quietly. What if it doesn't? It will, he says, tucking her hair behind the points of her ears. Besides, you're the strongest, most amazing person I know. It's gonna take more than nausea to put you down. Easy for you to say. Rayla sucks in a breath. She pulls back from the seat, her eyes shut tight, her hands pressed against her forehead as if that might keep the room steady, but she's up for all of 10 seconds before the bile rises in her throat once more. She gags into the bowl, her shoulders shaking with the exertion, and she half expects Callum to leave, irked by the sound or the smell or something. But he doesn't. It can't be nice, having to listen to his wife empty the contents of her already empty stomach, and he can't enjoy holding her hair back to keep vomit out of the silver, or having to put up with the smell of sickness every morning, but he's patient and undeterred, like usual. He rubs his free hand across her back, helps her off the bathroom floor when she's finally done, tucks her back into bed and brews another mug of tea for her, unprompted. And when he presses it into her hands, Rayla starts to cry. Hey. Callum shifts in the bed, panic in his eyes and in his voice, and she knows he means well, and that he just wants to make it better, but knowing that just makes it worse. Rayla whimpers. How are you so nice? Callum frowns at her, confused what? She bats at him, frustrated and grateful and sad without really knowing why. It's the hormones, she reasons, there's a bunch of them stewing within her, and it's normal to be moody and upset by the most irrational things, but that's the problem. She's not reasonable or rational right now in the least, and it's bad enough that Callum's been going out of his way to take care of her, and now there's this too. She curls into herself. Leans forward in the bed until her forehead meets his shoulders and her tears leave stains in the sleeve of his shirt. I just like you a lot, she sniffles. I don't, hick, you have no idea how much I appreciate you and... Callum lets out a disbelieving sort of chuckle. There's no malice in it. No mockery. It just sounds flattered by her ridiculousness. Let me get this straight, he says, trying to make sense of it. You're upset, because you appreciate me. She shushes him and swats feebly at his arm like it'll help. Just, hick, let me okay. He says nothing for a while. Rayla gets the feeling he's trying not to laugh again for her sake. If he did, it'd be fair, and she wouldn't even be mad, she'd laugh at herself too, if she could, but he's far too nice for that, as always. He pries the tea out of her hands instead, more patient and careful and understanding than he should have any right to be, and sets it on the nightstand. You're not dumb, he says gently. You just need a hug. She pouts against his arm, but it would be a lie to deny it. A hug would be nice. He does chuckle then. Gathers her into his arms and presses a kiss to her forehead, hiding that amused little smile against her skin. It'll pass, he says again. The weird emotional stuff too. You'll feel like yourself again in no time. Rayla sniffles once more. She believes him. Art by hostess. The second time it happens, Rayla's a little more prepared for it. They're in Adamina for a negotiation about human mining operations near or on this side of the breach, just for minerals, and for stones imbued with primal energy so it's more readily available and there's no reason for humans to turn back to dark magic, nothing untoward, but the elves here, everywhere, are stubborn, even if the ones in this city are marginally more amenable to change in comparison. She's pouting at her reflection this morning. Yesterday it had become pretty clear that fitting into her old gear isn't really an option anymore, and the dress suits her, but she's grumpy about it. She doesn't like dresses at the best of times, but there's something about having to wear a maternity dress that makes her feel more vulnerable than she already is. It's hard to explain. It's fine for Callum to see her weaknesses, she thinks. It's not fine for everyone else to see them too. Callum frowns at her on his way past the bathroom. What's wrong? Rayla feels it before it happens this time. The upset building in her throat. The irrational sadness in her chest. The fluid in her eyes. She pauses. Her voice sounds strangled in her own ears. Callum's frown only deepens. Starting to show, he asks uncertainly. She nods, her lips tilting downwards in the mirror, her hands drifting to the material of her dress to pull it tight over the swell. It's not even that big a bump yet. She's only 17 weeks along, and she's only going to get bigger from this point on. It's not like she's ever had a problem with her body image. She's never really cared to begin with, and it's certainly not like she's suddenly unattractive because of the extra weight. There's just insecurity now, and she looks to Callum with a pout. I've never been so big before, she murmurs. He raises an eyebrow at her. Well, yeah, he says reasonably. You've never been pregnant before. But, she presses her lips shut. It's hormones, she reminds herself. She's not really upset. She's just moody, and pregnancy is not so easy to reason with. Callum purses his own lips, the understanding clear in his eyes. I still think you're beautiful, he offers, abandoning his own tasks to loop his hands around her waist. He rubs the bump affectionately and smiles at her reflection in the mirror. If anything, I think you look even prettier. You've got your glow. Her lip trembles. Her throat hurts. Her eyes fill with tears, but she blinks and ducks her head to hide them before they fall. If Callum notices, he does, and she knows it. He doesn't say anything. He only smiles, leaving a kiss in her hair and that familiar warmth in her chest. She tries not to let it bother her too much after that. The aches and pains start at 19 weeks. They're on their way back to Catolis, but they've got time to stop in and say hello to Rayla's uncles, so that's where they are headed when Rayla starts wincing every time she climbs on and off from her filly's back. Vorobei's not a particularly rough horse, but she's not so gentle either, and it certainly isn't helping the ligaments in Rayla's abdomen or the bones in her back. She tries not to fuss about it. She's had worse, and she's not about to let a little ache stop her or slow her down, but it does hurt, and of course Callum notices because he notices everything, no matter how subtle she thinks she's being. They could stop for the night in Lantha. It's becoming a pretty frequent stop for them, they like Callum there, and it's a nice city, all things considered. Theoretically, though, if they kept riding, they'd get home by dawn tomorrow, but Callum's frowning at the way she grimaces with Vorobei's movements and she has a feeling he won't take no for an answer. You need to take it easy, he says, disapprovingly. Rayla purses her lips at him. We're only riding, she says, pointed and stubborn. It's not like I'm doing any work other than that. Yeah, but you're in pain, he argues. Don't pretend you're not, he adds sharply. I can see you wincing when you think I'm not looking. Your uncles won't mind if we don't get there till tomorrow evening. It's true, but still. Rayla pouts, pretending her hips and her back aren't killing her. They are, even as she groans under her breath when she climbs off Vorobei. Inwardly, she's glad. Like the million other things she won't admit, the ache is growing harder and harder to bear, and the idea of sleeping it off is considerably more appealing than riding through the night, even if it means another stop in Lantha. They settle in their room, and Rayla stifles a moan when she takes a seat on the bed. The mattress dips under her weight, and while it's not her own, or even the one in Catullus, it's definitely more comfortable than Vorobei's saddle, and she's secretly very grateful Callum insisted. She goes to sleep that night contented, her face buried in Callum's back, her arm draped loosely over his waist, and all is well until she wakes. She's not sure why, at first. It's still dark outside, and it feels like there are still hours before dawn. She bristles, still half asleep, but then she tries to turn over and her hips groan in protest. It's not a dull ache anymore, it's sharp and it radiates up her back and down to her knees. Her joints feel like they are on fire and it catches her so off guard that Rayla lets out a cry. She claps a hand over her mouth to mute it, but it's too late. Callum jolts awake beside her, his eyes clear and full of concern even in the poor light. Hey, he whispers. Hey, what's wrong? Are you okay? Rayla sucks in a breath that doesn't quite make it all the way in, and she shudders as the pain settles and fades. I'm fine, she manages. Her voice trembles, and it doesn't even hurt so much anymore, but moon and stars, is she crying? She swallows. My hips really hurt. Sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. Are you seriously apologizing right now? Callum frowns at her through the dark. He scribbles a rune in the air, the glow lights his face and the worried frown creasing his brow, and he whispers into it and brings a little ball of light to life in his hands. Rayla squints. Rubs her hands over her face to hide the tears and to shield her eyes from the light. I'm fine, she says again, sniffling a little. I'm okay now. Are you? Yeah. Rayla takes one more breath. A slower one this time, willing the last of the ache out of her bones so she might be able to go back to sleep. When she lays back down on her left, her bones creak in the effort, and she clenches her jaw shut to keep the sound in. Callum studies her, unimpressed. Then he climbs out of bed. Put this between your knees, he says gently, snatching a cushion off the chaise in the corner. It'll keep your hips aligned and hopefully ease the pain. It was in the notes the healer gave me ages ago, he adds, catching her frown as he seats himself on her side of the bed. Do you want me to stay up till you fall asleep? He's so sweet it almost sets her off again. Rayla shakes her head. It's fine, she murmurs, easing the cushion between her legs. The relief is almost instant, and she sighs as the ache eases at last. Thanks. Don't even worry about it, whispers Callum, tucking her hair behind her ear. You okay? Rayla swallows. I will be. There's an attack on the castle when Rayla's about 21 weeks along. They'd come back in a hurry. A clinic's burned down, and there are tensions rising between elves and humans in Catullus that certainly weren't there when they left. They'd discussed it with Ezran as soon as they'd arrived, but it doesn't make sense. Things were fine. Things were good. And now? Rayla lets out a shudder. The assassins that had broken in were there for her, and they'd come so close. The memory of her own blood between her thighs is fresh, and her belly still twinges as the baby moves within it, but gods, if she'd been any less lucky, if Callum hadn't woken when he did. She doesn't like thinking about it. There's a shop in the city called the Wishbone. It's run by a couple of friends of theirs, and Soren and Claudia help run it often enough that it's felt safer than the castle these past few days. Rowena, her midwife, has been by almost daily. Bathing helps, she tells Rayla. It takes a little of the weight off your back and the warm water will help with any pain. She's right. It does. It's one of the few things Rayla's allowed to get out of bed for, and while she'd argue, normally, the fear of making things worse, of losing the baby, is too real. She's in the tub again when Callum visits later that week. He's been avoiding it, visiting the shop too often might give away her hiding place, and the last thing they need is for anyone to know she's there and vulnerable. It's been awful for her, but it's no better for him. She's never seen shadows so prominent under his eyes, and his face is hard when he lets himself into the bathroom that morning. It falters only a little when he catches sight of her. Something like a smile tilts his lips, but it's grim and sad. "How are you feeling?" Rayla shrugs. Her throat is raw, and while the swell in her belly is growing, it's not so big yet that she can't draw her knees to her. She sets a hand on it beneath the water, her breath caught in her throat until she feels it twitch under her fingers, but she sighs in the end. "Could be better," she murmurs, resting her chin in the valley between her knees. "How are things on your end?" Callum breathes out through his nose, exhausted. "The same," he says quietly, crossing the tiny bathroom to sit against the edge of the tub. "I brought you your things. Eleni said to just leave them in Lesser's room. Your butterfly blades are right at the bottom, so you don't have to worry about her getting into them." He presses his lips shut for a moment. The sentence sounds clipped, like he wants to say something else, a joke, maybe, but he only shakes his head and brushes a lock of her hair out of her face. Rayla hums and leans into his touch. How she'd missed it. The tenderness of his fingers. The care of his hands. It's pathetic, she thinks, but she can't fault herself for it. Not now. Not while things have been so dire. "I miss you," mutters Callum, his words thick with emotion. "I don't think we've been apart for this long in ever," finishes Rayla. Her own voice trembles, but she offers him the closest thing to a smile she can muster. "I wish," she takes a breath. She wishes a lot of things right now, and there are too many of them to say out loud. She sniffles and lifts a hand to catch his. "I wish things were different," she mumbles, pressing his fingers to her lips. "I wish we could just be, you know." "Yeah," whispers Callum. "I know." He takes his own breath, one long shuddering one that fills the rest of his body with resolve, and bends to press a kiss into her hair. "I wish that too." They move her to the Bantha Lodge as soon as Rowena clears her for travel. Rayla's not happy about it, but there's not much of a choice. It's this, or stay in the capital and risk another attack, and she's more vulnerable than she's ever been in her life, and as much as she hates it, as weak as it makes her feel, she's not stubborn enough to risk the life of her unborn child on something as stupid as her own pride. It still sucks, though. Callum doesn't come with her because Ez needs him. There's too much tension in the city for him to handle on his own, and, in any case, there's an assassin's conspirator to find, and he can't do that from the lodge. It makes for quiet, lonely days, even with Rowena, and Soren, and Claudia for company, and Rayla whiles away the hours sitting by the front steps and waiting for news. Weeks pass. Then a month. Then another. There is none. Only Callum's "I love yous" and "I miss yous" that appear in the little handheld magic mirror that they've been using for communication since she left. Moon and stars, how she misses him. He should be here, or at least, she should be there, and he should get to put his hands on her belly and laugh at the way his child twitches and rolls and kicks within her. He should be able to talk to it the way she does, and marvel at how quickly it's grown. "You miss him too, huh?" she says quietly to her bump one day. She turns her mirror over in her hands, waiting for his handwriting to light it up in her hands. "It won't be for too much longer, little one. Dad's just got some stuff to take care of. He wants us to be safe." She draws a breath. She's cried a lot this pregnancy. It's completely normal, Rowena tells her, and it's beyond her control. She shouldn't be so hard on herself, and sometimes it helps to cry. It doesn't now. She hardly does anything most days while they're out here, the others won't let her, but Rayla finds herself exhausted all the time. That's normal too, Rowena promises while she's doing one of her checkups. Growing a baby is hard work, and you've been through more than most. You should take the opportunity to nap while you can, Your Highness. I don't know that you'll have that luxury once the baby comes. It's supposed to be a half joke, Rayla thinks. Rowena's smile is kind and understanding, but there's a spark of amusement in it too, perhaps because Rayla's so ostensibly and comically frustrated by the way her body seems to want nothing but to eat and sleep. She'll be coming up on 30 weeks now. The baby squirms and wriggles all day every day, seemingly ignorant of the fact that it's running out of room. Its feet get caught in her ribs, and it nudges into her bladder, and sometimes, it moves so much that it's difficult to sleep anyway, and Rayla spends what's supposed to be her afternoon nap watching it wriggle, half exasperated, half ended by the way her whole belly shifts with its movements. Other women, not that Rayla personally knows many who've been through this to begin with, had made this sound magical. A wondrous, miraculous time in any woman's life full of love for a person yet to be. Rayla had had her doubts, but this just about seals the deal. Pregnancy sucks and no part of actually being pregnant feels magical at all. Maybe a year from now, when this is all done and over with and her child's a crying mess, she might look back and miss the days she'd just watch her belly move, but right now, at this moment, while her hips ache and her breath is short and what she thinks is an elbow is pressing painfully outwards in her womb, life could not be any harder. She wishes Callum were here. The others are probably sick of listening to her grumble to herself, but Callum had been nothing but supportive and she's certain that, if she asked him, he'd rub the tension out of her back and her shoulders without even pausing to think about it. He'd hold her close and smooth her hair and read her to sleep if she needed it. His very presence would be a comfort in and of itself. But the fact is he's not here, and it's just one more thing on top of a very long list of things that suck really, really bad. She spills the milk one morning. She's been a lot clumsier recently too, and it's not just because she's so much bigger than she used to be. The jug tips, and milk runs over the counter and splashes at her feet. Rayla stares at the puddle for 3, 4, 5 seconds, before her frustration gets the better of her at long last, and she starts to cry. Claudia doesn't even ask. Go sit down, she says gently, ushering her out of the kitchen. I'll take care of this. Do you want a heat pack for you back? Yes, blubbers Rayla, aware of how ridiculous, how pathetic, she sounds. Just, don't even. I wasn't going to, chuckles Claudia. Go on. Leave this to me. Sometimes, Rayla remembers that there's history between them. Not good history. History that she's not particularly proud of, and, she imagines, history that Claudia's not particularly proud of. But things have changed a lot since then, and she's reminded, not for the first time, of how grateful she is for Claudia's presence at the lodge. Sorry I'm a pain, she mutters, when Claudia joins her on the front steps with a heat pack in one hand and a plate of tarts in the other. You're not a pain, says Claudia. You're just pregnant. You shouldn't apologize for that. In spite of herself, Rayla laughs. Pregnancy still sucks, she thinks, but it's not so bad with good company. Her little girl is born after midnight. At least, Rayla thinks it's after midnight. It's hard to be sure. The contractions had started late in the evening, and then it was a kind of a rush to get her out of harm's way as General Balance forces descended on the mountain. There was pain, and there was blood, and a battle, further down from the heart of the moon nexus, and oh, how terrifying it had all been. But she doesn't think about any of that. Callum is here now. They are safe now. Everything is fine now. And their baby, they'd named her, is the most beautiful thing she's ever seen. She's so tiny, whispers Callum, and, indeed, she is. His hands are big compared to Rayla's, but they are the perfect size to cradle his baby girl, and in spite of everything that's happened, and how hard this pregnancy has been, Rayla's heart is full. She wonders if she might cry again, but there are no tears left. She's grateful to be alive, and happy to meet her daughter, and so in love with Callum and the way he coos at their child as he holds her in his arms for the first time. And then to her great surprise, he starts to cry. Rayla's lips pull upwards, and she's not sure if she's smiling because she's happy or because she thinks it's funny or because she thinks turnabout is fair play. Are you okay? She asks him quietly. He nods pathetically, his shoulders shaking with emotion. I love you both so much and... You don't have to explain, chuckles Rayla, putting her hands over his. I get it. He sniffles. She's so beautiful, Rayla, and I know it's been a long night, but, it's been so long, and I started to wonder if this day would ever come and, gods, I was so scared I was going to lose one or both of you tonight, and I'm just so happy. Callum. My love. Rayla swallows a laugh and brushes his hair out of his eyes. Seemia, she whispers, pulling him to her. He lets her without resistance, rests his forehead against her shoulder and sobs until his tears leave dark stains in his scarf-turned swaddle. His shoulders shake, but his hands are firm and steady all the while, tucked securely around Sarai while she sleeps. Rayla presses a kiss against his temple and hides a smile against his skin. You've been so strong for us, she murmurs, running her fingers through his hair. You took such good care of me when I was emotional. I think it's our turn to let you cry now. He chokes out a laugh. And, in turn, he presses a kiss to Sarai's temple, mindful of the way she fidgets in her sleep. Everything's gonna be okay now, he whispers. Mum and Dad are both here. You're gonna be just fine. We all will be, adds Rayla, her face shining with joy and hope and love. That's a promise. It's one they keep. Chapter 1. Chapter text. Prologue. Kira's nice in the summer. It's probably one Sarai's favorite places on this side of the border. She's pretty well traveled for someone so young, but the peace and quiet here is something even she could never grow tired of. It's only a little town. The politics are simple and uncomplicated, and it's nice to see Mum and Dad relax every once in a while. Sarai thinks it's good for them. She gets it. Being ambassadors, and the Prince and Princess of Katolis, no less, sounds hard, and it's relatively rare that they get time off. There's always some treaty to oversee, or some negotiation they have to be present at, too many expectations and formalities and customs they have to adhere to. Sometimes it's just nice to see Mum without tension in her back, and Dad without strain in his smile. She wishes they could just stay put sometimes. There's a cottage in Katolis they only sometimes use, and Ranan and Tinker have even offered for them to stay in their home. It's too quiet without them, Tinker says, and they don't visit enough, but brokering peace between Zadia and the human kingdoms comes first, and that's something even Sarai had come to understand a long time ago. She's a few months off her 15th birthday now. People on both sides of the border still look at her funny. They blink at her ears, round like Dad's, and at her horns, slanted towards the back of her head, like Mum's, and although it's been a long time since any of it really mattered, it still catches people by surprise. It shouldn't, Mum had told her when she was younger. They were in a lawn. She was 8, and there were children who thought she looked strange. Mum's smile was sad, but there was understanding in her eyes as she tucked the brown of Sarai's hair behind the gentle curve of her ears. You're just different, she'd said. And different isn't the same as bad. They said my ears were ugly, Sarai had murmured. Mum had chuckled at her. You're still the prettiest little moonbeam to me. She'd kissed her forehead then, and held her till her sniffles settled and her eyelids grew heavy, and in the morning, Dad taught her a new rune, one that conjured the illusion of a great glowing spider that sent those kids running for good. At least here in Kira, the elves have grown used to her. As much as Tinker disagrees, she and Mum and Dad visit often enough that most of the townspeople know her by name. She even spent all of last summer here. It had taken a lot to convince Mum of it, but Sarai got her way in the end. It was a good summer. Probably the only thing that would have made it better was if Lesser and Turin could have come to stay too, but Sarai supposes even now that would have been having her cake and eating it too. They'd ridden into town early this evening. Tinker had dinner ready for them while Dad disappeared to take the horses to the stalls around the back, and already, Mum looked relieved. Long journey, then? Tinker had asked, his grin pleased and lopsided. Little bit, snorted Mum, hugging him and Ranan in turn. It's just good to be back. They'd settled in. Ranan had moonberry surprise waiting for them in the oven for dessert. Sarai had half of it on her own, much to her parents' chagrin. Now she's sitting on the steps of the back porch, mug of tea in hand, while the fireflies in the meadow behind Ranan and Tinker's house blink cheerfully at her in the night. What's the plan now, then? She hears Tinker ask. Not leaving again too soon, I hope. We'll probably stay the week, says Dad. But we wanted to be back in Katolis in time for the festival. There's usually a ball every year we have to make an appearance at, but we won't have to leave until the end of the week at the earliest. Taking your time for once, I see, says Ranan mildly. Sorry, I hears him slurp a little at his own tea. He pauses for a moment. There's been some talk, he adds. We've overheard some of the human merchants that pass by here. Is it true your king's to marry soon? Mum snorts into her tea at that. They've been bothering us about that for years, she scoffs. Sorry, I imagine she's probably waving them off. They just want him to produce heirs. Which I still don't really understand when he's named Callum. That's different, chastises Dad, like they've had this discussion a million times. In all fairness, they probably have. Sorry, I've eavesdropped on them talking about this more than once. An heir presumptive isn't the same as a true blood heir. Don't get me wrong, it's nobody's business but Ez's whether he chooses to marry or not, but from a certain standpoint, I can see why Opalai and the rest of the council are getting antsy. Mum bristles. We're not at war anymore, there's no need for them to be pushy about it. Ez isn't a kid anymore either, and he can't put it off forever. Dad pauses. Sorry, I can practically hear him thinking from all the way out here. I think we all know why he doesn't want to get married anyway. And that is, asks Ranan. Another pause. Sorry, I wonders if Mum and Dad are doing that thing again, where they look at each other and have a full conversation without saying, or even signing, anything. Anya, says Dad at last. Sorry, I stifles a snort into her tea. There's no secret there. Not to them, at least. She's barely 15 and even she knows that there's something between them Uncle Ez won't talk about. He's not stupid, he knows exactly what it is, but he won't admit to it either. They're just friends, he says. In any case, he's young, and he's healthy, producing heirs right now isn't a priority, especially when he's got Dad assuming the role of his heir presumptive. He pretends it's nothing. He grins and jokes and brushes it off, and sometimes it's hard to tell if he's faking it or ignoring the issue outright. Sorry, I wishes he wouldn't, he doesn't fool her, and he certainly doesn't fool her parents. Anya, she hears Tinker say. The Queen of Duran. That Anya. There's only one, snorts Mum, although it sounds more rueful than anything else. It's complicated, she says carefully. There's a lot of politics around it and I think maybe the longer he stalls, the less he has to think about it. I don't understand, says Tinker. What's the problem, exactly? They are the same age, they are both ruling monarchs, they both need heirs, as far as I know, what's stopping them? Well, begins Dad. Heirs. It's not like here. Katolis and Duran are two separate states, Ez governs one, and Anya governs the other. Say they do get married, if they have a kid, which kingdom does it get? Duran. Katolis. Both. Neither. Does Ez give up his throne or does Anya? I know, okay, it sounds stupid, but it's not fair to either of their people to leave them without a leader. But isn't that what you're for? Dad says nothing for a moment. Sorry, I has a suspicion he might be shaking his head. I'm a last resort, he says. If anything happens to Ez before he can produce an heir, then I step in. Otherwise, I'm not appropriate. He's put himself in a bit of a bind, hasn't he, says Ranan mildly. What do you think? Sorry, I jumps. She stares at the last dregs of her tea, guilty grimace crossing her face, but when she peeks around the corner, no one looks even a little surprised that she's there to begin with. Mum rolls her eyes, lips twitching upwards in amusement. Dad's smirk is knowing and unexasperated. Ranan and Tinker look at her like they expected nothing less. Sorry, I grins at them all, a little sheepish and a little embarrassed, but she gets to her feet anyway, empty cup between her hands. How do you know? You're gonna have to try a little harder than that to fool us, says Dad, beckoning her forward. What do you reckon? Think there's a way out of this for Uncle Ez? Sorry, I shrugs. She knows the nuances and complexities of being a ruling monarch almost as well as Mum and Dad do, but to her, it's all just stupid. There's too much fluff, too much pomp and circumstance around things that don't matter. Personally, she doesn't even like the fact that Dad is Uncle EZ's heir presumptive because it means that she's, technically, second in line for the Catolan throne. Lesser and Turin have been her friends since before she can even remember, and even they bow to her because of a technicality. I don't really know, she says at last. I think Uncle Ez deserves to be happy, though. If he wants to stall because he doesn't want to marry someone he doesn't know, or because he'd rather marry someone that he can't, I don't really think he can be blamed for it. You're right there, chuckles Mum. Do you want some more tea? Sorry, I shakes her head, relieved that that's the end of it. She's not particularly in the mood to discuss something so complicated today. She'd rather liked just watching the fireflies. I'm good. Although I might go up to bed, if that's okay. It's been a long day. Whatever you like, lovely, says Dad with a smile. Sleep tight. Sorry, I smiles back. Night, she says. Thanks for dinner, Tinker. And the Moonbury surprise was okay, I guess. She smirks at Run-On, but he only smirks back. Don't eat half of it on your own if you hate it so much, he teases. Good night, my dear. There's silence as she heads upstairs. Sorry, I half wonders if they think she might be listening again, but she hears Run-On joke as she steps onto the landing. Such disrespect, he snorts. Wonder where she gets it from. You, probably, says Mum without missing a beat. Their hushed laughter fills the dining room, and Sorry, I snorts to herself as she closes her bedroom door. Chapter 2. Summary. You've been very good at avoiding this conversation, says Opalai, her voice stern, but with respect. Your Majesty, you can't keep ignoring this forever. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. The ball and the festival have sort of become an annual thing. This year, he didn't even have to suggest it, a representative for the common folk had come to ask him about it personally, and in perfect honesty, Ez was thrilled. It had been an excuse the first time he'd held it, pieces better forged in celebration than anything else, and admittedly, that first time he'd timed it so he could announce Callum and Rayla's engagement, assuming they agreed, all those years ago. He's glad that it's become a thing all on its own, a tradition of sorts, that both elves and humans have come to share, and even though they are still about a week out, the city's already abuzz. The flags are hung, and the streamers are up, and he's received RSVPs from most of his guests, regulars, at this point, already. Spirits are high within the castle and amongst the common folk, but there is just one thing. Opalai's hard gaze from across the council room doesn't let Ez forget it. She waits until the meeting closes, and until Ez dismisses the rest of the High Council before she addresses it. Ez stops her with a hand before she even opens her mouth. We've talked about this, Opalai. No, we haven't, she says, her voice stern. You've been very good at avoiding this conversation, but with respect, Your Majesty, you can't keep ignoring this forever. I'm not ignoring it, says Ez pointedly, but he glances away anyway, guilty because he absolutely is. But there are other, more pressing matters to deal with right now. More pressing than establishing a line of succession. I have Callum for that. That's not the same, Your Majesty, and you know that. Opalai lets out a sigh, tired and so done with his refusal to talk about this. Ez can't even blame her. He's not a child anymore, and he hasn't been for a very long time. He's running out of reasons to avoid this conversation, and even he knows that he can't keep this up. At least consider the idea of finding a spouse at this ball, Your Majesty, she says. Ideally one who can provide you with heirs. Ez scowls at her. You know that there's a lot more to this marriage thing than producing heirs, right? You know that marriage tends to involve, love. You know better than anyone that that's a luxury you can't afford. Opalai lets out a huff, her frustration with him obvious in the way she massages at the bridge of her nose. My king, she says at last, gentler this time. You've had longer than most to adjust to this, but you've run out of time now. You can't ignore this any longer. I'm not ignoring it, snaps Ez again, but he tempers himself and relents. Opalai's only doing her job. He can't be mad at her for that. He sighs, trying to be patient, trying to be the cool and composed king his father was, and lifts the circlet off his head to run a tired hand through his hair. I get it, he mutters. I know what's at stake here, and it's unfair to the people of Catolis for me to keep putting it off. But, He trails off awkwardly, unsure what he even wants to say. The truth is that this isn't because he doesn't want to get married, it's that he does, and he can't. Opala reads it on his face. Her eyes soften at last, and when she speaks again, her voice is soft. She's not an option, Your Majesty, she says quietly. You know that. He does know that. He knows it so well that he's made a concerted effort to avoid talking about it since he became of age. He sighs. Just give me time to talk to my brother, he says finally. He'll be here within the week. We can talk about it then. Okay. Opala purses her lips. She's not entirely happy with it, as can tell that much, but there's understanding on her face too. In the end, she bows. Of course, Your Majesty, she says at last. As long as we do talk about it. Es nods, a reluctant grimace crossing his face. We will. I mean that this time. X. He does mean it, but it doesn't make it any easier to think about, particularly not when the envoys from Duran arrive that same afternoon. They are hard to miss, even from the balcony attached to his study. The pale blue of their carriages catch his eye long before the horns sound as they approach the castle gates, and Es watches, following the line of blue and gold as it parts the sea of his citizens until he spots the carriage at the end. In spite of the circumstances, the twitch in his lips is difficult to suppress. It's rare that Anya herself attends functions like these, but she makes an effort for this ball every year. It's pretty standard behavior for her to arrive early, but a week is a little out of the ordinary, even if he has been expecting it. She'd mentioned it in her last letter, something about needing some time off whether her advisors agree with her or not. Personally, Es finds it funny. Arriving early to assist in festival preparations is hardly time off, and, more than anything, it sounds like an excuse. Still, he's not about to complain. It's been a while, and he likes her company. Who is he to try and stop her? He makes his way down to the gates to wait for her with as much maturity as he can manage, but his grin only grows wider as her carriage pulls up in front of the main entrance. He clasps his hands behind him, his shoulders back, his back ramrod straight, the epitome of a dignified king waiting to greet an equally dignified queen, but there's a spark of mischief in his eye, one that she matches when she opens the carriage door. Your Majesty greets Es with a low bow. Anya's lips pull into a smirk. Your Majesty, she returns with a curtsy. It's an old game. They don't call each other by their titles anymore, but it's always fun to see who breaks formality first. It's usually Ezran, and today, it's no different. He snorts at her, cheeks puffing with mirth, suddenly 14 again in his heart. Where's my hug then? Anya laughs. It's pretty and bell-like, just like it was last time she was here, and it puts warmth in Ez's cheeks in spite of the way he's grown used to it over all these years. The time has been kind to her, the stress of ruling a kingdom like Duran showing only in the creases at the corners of her eyes when she smiles. She steps towards him, still dignified, still unfairly majestic, and pulls him into an embrace he hadn't realized he'd missed. It's been too long, she says into his shoulder, and Ez chuckles. You can just visit like a normal person, you know. At this rate, you probably see Callum, Rayla, and Sarai more often than you see me. I mean, you could visit me. That goes both ways, you know. She pulls away from him, impish smile gracing her lips. Tush laughs as, offering her his arm. How was the trip? She grins at him, her fingers light against his sleeve. Long, she says. Needlessly so. It would have been faster if I'd just come by myself, but, you know what it's like. I'm sure your staff don't like letting you out of their sight either. She shakes her head and stifles a snort into the back of her other hand. It's a rare show of not so ladylike behavior, closer to a slip in her composure than anything else, but Ez only grins. What you need is a jelly tart, he says, leading her up the steps and into the entrance hall. Maybe some tea too. I figure we've got a lot to catch up on. Yes, says Anya. Her smile falters just a little. We do. X. Sorry, I recognizes the horns the moment she hears them. They are only a little way out from the city gates now, and despite the fact that she only ever hears them once a year, she knows exactly what they are and what they mean. She tugs on Colibri's reins, slowing her stallion until she can turn and face Mum and Dad as they lag behind. I think Aunt Anya beat us here this year. That's different, says Mum mildly. She eases Vorobei forward, leaning a little to scratch the spot just behind her ears. She's getting on in age, she's not as quick or as graceful as she once was, but Mum still likes her all the same. She's early. Ez did say she wanted to help with preparations this year, says Dad, but he catches Mum's eye, his eyebrows knitting together in a thoughtful frown. There's a question in the air that he doesn't need to actually ask, one obvious even to Sarai, especially while their conversation with Ranan and Tinker is still fresh in her mind. In all honesty, she's wondering too, if Aunt Anya's real intentions might center around the problem she and Uncle Ez have found themselves in, but the answer to that isn't all the way out here. She shakes Colibri's reins impatiently, eager to see Uncle Ez, and Aunt Anya, and Lesser, and Turin, and even more eager to be home for the week. Shouldn't we hurry, then? Mum raises an eyebrow at her. You're in a rush, she comments. The castle's not going anywhere, you know. We'll get there in time. You guys are taking forever, whines Sarai. Not on purpose, chuckles Dad. He combs his fingers through Kuritsa's mane fondly, a reminder that she's getting old too, and that she and Vorobei can only move so fast now. He shoots a sidelong glance at Mum and purses his lips. Why don't you go on ahead, he says after a moment. We can meet you there. Sarai swells excitedly, but Mum cuts her off with a frown. Not by herself. She'll be okay, assures Dad, waving her off. Won't you, Sarai? Callum. Dad gives her a look. Between the two of them, Mum's always a little more overbearing, and to some extent, Sarai understands. She knows the story. Uncle Ez had told her all about the circumstances of her birth when she was younger, but she's not a kid anymore either, and Mum needs to calm down. She will be fine. It's not like she can't defend herself if anything goes awry. Mum had personally made sure of that. Come off it, Mum, she says, tugging Colibri around with a grin. I'll be all right. I'll see you both later. She shakes Colibri's reins without waiting for further permission, clicks her tongue at the stallion and urges him into a gallop. She thinks she hears Mum protest after her, but it's too late. She's off like a shot, the wind in her hair, the reins secure in her hands, her traveling cloak fluttering behind her in the warm spring breeze. The dirt road beneath them is worn and familiar. Sarai knows it so well she could probably steer Colibri through it with her eyes closed, in spite of the way it meanders through the wood like a great winding snake. When the city gates come into view, she whoops a greeting at the guards, grinning at the way they scramble out of the way for her and Colibri. Slow down, princess, they call at her, but she only laughs. I'd rather not, she hollers. She and Colibri race under the portcullis, her grin bright on her features, and she tugs him to a canter only as he clops into the crowded market. The common folk part for her, some even bow, which makes her grimace, but she eases Colibri through the sea of people, intent on dropping by the wishbone on her way to the castle. Lesser should be there today. If she's lucky, Turin might be too, but she'll see him later regardless. He's training to be part of Uncle Ez's crown guard now, so he'll be around one way or another. The cobblestones clip and clop under Colibri's hooves as he slows in an effort to avoid knocking anyone over, and when the battered hanging sign of the wishbone comes into view, she hops off him at last and tugs him to the stalls by the side of the shop. She peers through the back window curiously, and the corners of her lips tug into a mischievous smirk when she spots Lesser chatting up a pretty elf girl by the counter. She snickers to herself and ducks under the window to scribble a rune into the air. Invisibilia, she whispers, and when her fingers become transparent, she waits until the elf girl leaves before sneaks into the shop as the door closes behind her. Lesser's grin is cocky. Inwardly, Sarai wonders if she's been spending a little too much time with Uncle Soren, and it would be a waste of an opportunity if she didn't take the chance to scare it off her face. She steps towards her, her footsteps light, her traveling cloak hitched off the ground to keep it from brushing dust off the floorboards, and when Lesser settles behind the counter again, Sarai leaps, her invisibility fading when she slams a hand against the bench. Boo! Lesser shrieks. She topples backwards with an undignified yelp, her book and her chair clattering loudly against the floor. Sarai laughs, her sides aching as Lesser sculls at her and pushes herself back onto her feet. Sarai, she snaps. Then she blinks, and a grin splits her features. Sarai. Hi, Lesser greets Sarai, her smirk cheeky and wide. Got a new girlfriend I should know about? Lesser has the decency to flush. She's just a friend, she grumbles, picking her book off the ground and dusting her surcoat off. What are you, 8? How long have you been here? Long enough. Sorry, I grins at her, stepping around the counter to help her with the fallen chair. Did Uncle Soren give you those tips on how to pick up? Lesser scowls at her and swats her arm. She's just a friend, she snarls. Don't be a brat. Princess or not, I will end you. First of all, don't call me that. Second, you want to face the wrath of my mother. Sorry, I rolls her eyes at her. Yeah. Good luck. How are things? Lesser lets out a huff. Her hair's a little longer, and she's grown a little taller. She's a full head taller than Sorry I now, horns and all, but the gold in her eyes is still the same. She regards Sorry I with a sort of exasperation, one that she's grown fairly used to given all the trouble she routinely gets in and of, but in the end, she tucks her into a hug and grins against her hair. The same, she says. Still trying to convince Mom and Dad to let me go to Lantha to study, but that's not new. But Queen Anya came through just before. That's kind of interesting, right? She's really early this year. I heard, admits Sorry I, prying herself out of the embrace. Apparently she wanted to help with this year's festivities, but I dunno. It's kinda complicated, and even then, I'm not really sure if that's what's really happening. Honestly, it's just more reasons being royalty sucks. Oh. Lesser raises an eyebrow at her. What do you know, exactly? Sorry, I hesitates. It's not that she doesn't trust Lesser. It's that she wants to be sure. The last thing she wants is to start rumors about Uncle Ez and Aunt Anya. They have enough to deal with right now, and there's too much danger here of being overheard. She shakes her head. Nothing yet. Nothing people aren't already talking about, anyway. She shrugs. I'll find out later, probably. Mum and Dad'll probably have a talk to Uncle Ez about it tonight. Lesser snorts a little. Not that I don't enjoy the gossip, but you really have to stop eavesdropping on your parents' conversations. It's not princess-like at all. Oh, but you love the gossip, teases Sorry I, ignoring the jab at her title. You live off it. It's how you draw those girls in. Stop it. How else will you pick up without my everlasting font of political intrigue? Now you're just being annoying. Lesser rolls her eyes at her and tosses the polishing rag on the till at her face. She pitches her voice up, mocking and pretend polite. Don't you have other things to do, Your Highness? Surely His Majesty would want to see you now that you're in the city. You stop it. I'm only being courteous. She throws in a curtsy for good measure, smirking at the way Sorry I skulls. I'm so humbled by your visit to my parents' shop, Princess. It's such an honor to be visited by someone of such nobility. Enough, snaps Sorry I. She throws her arms up in defeat and sighs. Fine. I'll leave you alone. I'll come by to catch up properly when Turin's free. As you wish, Your Highness, teases Lesser with another curtsy. It's obviously a joke, but Sorry I grimaces anyway and tosses the polishing rag back at her. Bye, she drawls, waving her fingers lazily as she makes for the door. Oh, and the festival. Same arrangement as always, says Lesser with a grin. You just gotta find a way to get Turin out of his shift. But you know. You're the princess. I'm sure you'll figure something out. She winks, a smirk lifting the corners of her lips, and Sorry I laughs, for once not irritated by the use of her title. I'm sure I will, she chuckles, before she leaves the shop and tugs Colibri back out into the street. Notes. This is so far in the future that it's screwing me up, haha, God, I really hope Ez is still himself. Chapter 3. Summary. What I wouldn't give just to not deal with this for a day. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 2. You're not happy with me, are you? The question comes out a little sheepish, a little guilty, even, but it's better than the terse silence hanging between them. Callum urges Kuritsa forward, brings her in line with Vorobei until he can nudge Rayla's knee with his. She only huffs, avoiding his gaze with a grumpy pout set on her lips. Rayla. She bristles. You shouldn't have let her go alone. Rayla. Despite himself, Callum lets out a chuckle. He supposes he shouldn't be so surprised. Sorry, I is every bit as stubborn and precocious as they both were once upon a time, but Rayla's never had an easy time with her tendency to disappear. He's pretty certain Balan had something to do with that, even if all that happened more than a decade ago. He reaches for her, untangling one of her hands from Vorobei's reins to press a kiss against her palm. She's not a kid anymore, you know. She's 14. She's the same age I was when Ez and I went with you to take ZYM home. He squeezes her fingers patiently and tugs them both to a stop. She'll be okay. You know she will be. You made sure of it. Don't you trust her? Rayla breathes out a sigh. She still won't look at him, but he's close enough to her now that he can see the flicker of guilt in her eyes. I do, she mutters. I don't mean to be annoying about it, but she pauses, unsure exactly how to word what she wants to say. You worry anyway. Rayla glances at him at last, if only for a moment and from the corner of her eye, but Callum meets her gaze anyway, understanding in his eyes and patience in his smile. I worry too, he admits. All the time. But she's growing up and she won't thank us for fussing over her. We just have to trust that we taught her well enough not to do anything stupid. She's not the one I don't trust. She stares at the horn of Vorobei's saddle, lips turned downwards in a stubborn frown. Callum almost wants to laugh. There's so much of her in their daughter that he wonders a second time why he's even a little bit surprised. He squeezes her hand once more, enjoying the fit of her calloused fingertips against his palm as he brings them to his lips for another kiss. You can still trust her to know better, he offers. And that you taught her well enough to defend herself if she ever did find herself in trouble. He smiles at her, tries to reassure her with more than just words that it will be fine, and that it's perfectly natural to worry about their little girl and her penchant for trouble, it's just important not to let it get in the way. And if she can't, murmurs Rayla, get herself out of the trouble, I mean. Then we'll be there, says Callum. If she needs us, that's where we'll be. For now, we just have to trust her. Okay. A pause settles between them. There's tension in Rayla's shoulders, and while it doesn't really go away, she slumps in Vorobei's saddle and squeezes Callum's hand in return at long last. I'm sorry, she mumbles. Don't apologize, chuckles Callum. She'll be okay, Rayla. I know. Rayla takes a breath. She straightens in the saddle, fixes her eyes on a point on the road ahead of them, Vorobei's reins tight in her fist, but when she looks at him this time, she smiles. It's only a little one, and there's apprehension in it still, but it makes warmth bloom in Callum's chest all the same. It's strange to have come this far. Sometimes, it still hits him like a brick. The world is in the best place it's been in a very long while, and his own is so complete that, at times, it doesn't feel real, but Rayla's hand is firm within his, her touch like an anchor to this fantastic reality, and his doubt fades with the warmth of her fingers as she tugs them away to shake Vorobei's reins. Well, if we're going to meet her there, we'd better get a move on, she says. Best not keep her or Ez waiting, hey. Right as always, chuckles Callum. He clicks his tongue, and then they are moving again, along the winding road in the wood and towards the castle as it looms overhead. X. The staircase of the North Tower is an odd place for a member of the Crown Guard to stand guard, but that's where Turin's stationed today according to Uncle Soren, so that's where Sarai goes. Part of her wonders if he or Uncle Ezran had put him there on purpose, knowing she and Mum and Dad'd be back within the week, and that she'd find her way up there sooner or later. She supposes it saves them the trouble of coming to find her when she eventually disappears, and it saves her the trouble of scouring the rest of the castle to find Turin, so, really, she can't complain. She grins when she spots him. He's always been a bit paler than his sister, and he looks like Aunt Eleni with his red-brown hair and his grey eyes, the only obvious hints of his father in his horns and pointed ears and the light brown of his skin. His armor sort of dwarfs him, it fits okay, but he hasn't quite grown into it just yet. She supposes he'd look a lot more intimidating if it did, but as it is, it just highlights his relative youth. His lips twitch as her footsteps echo over the flagstones, and he almost steps out of line to greet her but remembers his place at the last minute. He bows as she passes instead, the way he's supposed to, but in a way that only makes Sarai groan. How many times do we have to talk about this, Turin? She hears him snort before he straightens. Always once more, princess. Turin. My apologies, princess. Turin, I swear to the moon and stars. All right, he says, dropping formalities at last. His shoulders slump, his grip on his halberd slackens just a bit, and the smirk on his lips gives way to a smile, one with a sort of shyness that soothes her irritation and tugs at the corners of her lips instead. You're back. Clearly says Sarai, her voice cheeky and playful. Been busy. If you call standing in one spot for hours at a time busy, sure, snorts Turin. My schedule's been packed. So I see, laughs Sarai. Guess I'll just wander off to the tower all by myself then. Considering you're too busy to keep me company. He falters. I was kidding. I'm not supposed to leave my post. Sure you're not, teases Sarai, starting up the spiral staircase with a shrug. No worries, then. You can just stay down here. Sarai. She smirks at him but doesn't turn. It sure would suck if something happened to me though, she drawls. Because I was up there. On my own. And the closest member of the Crown Guard was all the way down here, too afraid to leave his post. She waves her fingers lazily, enjoying his panic and his indecision. There's a part of her that supposes she shouldn't tease him so, but there's no fun in that, and some days, it's almost too easy. Bite her in, she adds, making no effort to hide the grin in her voice. Sorry, he hisses again. This isn't funny. Well, I mean, it is to me. Sorry, snorts at him and tosses a grin at him over her shoulder. You're a member of the Crown Guard, aren't you? I'm technically also the Crown, so if you stay down here, then I guess you're not really doing your job. He scowls at her. You hate that title, you're not allowed to use it against me like this. I'm the princess, she says sardonically. I can do what I like. She rounds the corner and waits. The silence at the top of the stairwell presses heavily against her ears and, for a moment, she wonders if he actually will just stay at his post, but the telltale clanking of Crown Guard armor sounds after her before long, and Sarai hides her giggle in the back of her wrist as Turin appears in the hall. If I get pulled up for this, you're taking responsibility for it, he snaps. Sarai's grin widens. You won't get pulled up for it, she chuckles, unlatching the trapdoor at the top of the stairs. We both know Uncle Soren stationed you up here to make sure I wouldn't disappear on them again. Pretty sure I've given him and Uncle Ez enough heart attacks about it for a lifetime. Good to see they're learning. Turin only frowns at her. Yeah, no offense, but you should probably stop doing that anyway. You're second in line for the throne and everything, and if something goes wrong. Nothing'll go wrong, says Sarai stubbornly. She shuts the trapdoor behind him with a huff, her irritation returning with the reminder. I can look after myself. And if there ever is a time I do need help, well. That's what I've got you for, right? She hops into an embrasure and settles, her feet dangling so precariously off the edge of the tower that Turin actually drops his halberd and hovers awkwardly at her back, afraid she might fall. Well, yes, he says, swallowing audibly. Don't go around tempting fate, though. She rolls her eyes at him. You'll go grey early if you stress so much. You need to relax. How anyone could possibly do that with you around, I don't know. That makes Sarai laugh. When she turns, she finds him flushing, his eyes turned to the ground, obviously embarrassed by the callousness of his words. My apologies, he mutters. I forgot myself, princess. Turin. Sorry. He offers her an awkward smile, more apologetic than any verbal apology, his flush closer to bashful this time, instead of embarrassed. It's been a little while, okay. I'm only ever allowed to call you Sarai to your face, so it might just take a little while to get used to, is all. It's just, you are, first and foremost, the princess and, it's not my place. I should just be your friend, grumbles Sarai. We've known each other literally forever, Turin. Just because you work here now, doesn't mean those titles and rules come back into play. She sighs, turning away from him to stare out over the city. What I wouldn't give just to not deal with this for a day. Behind her, Turin starts. She can feel his eyes against her back, can almost see the frown that wrinkles his brow even though she doesn't turn. She envies him and Lesser sometimes, all the time, if she's being honest. They live such normal lives, free from the trappings of palace life and the formalities of being the daughter of 2 ambassadors. There are days when she feels guilty for it. She loves her parents dearly, and she's probably had a better childhood than both of them put together, but it's also been one filled with other people's expectations and traditions. She just wants room for her own, she thinks. That's not such a big wish, is it? Why, sorry, Turin heaves a sigh. His armor clanks together as he moves, and when Sarai turns again, he's seated behind her, his back against the melon. What would you do, he asks. If you could, I mean. Sarai snorts to herself. Leave, I think, she answers quietly. We could take Lesser to Lantha so she can study magic like she's always wanted, and you and I. She pauses, unsure how she'd intended to finish that sentence. I dunno, she says after a moment. We could go somewhere not here, you know. Go someplace no one knows who I am and people aren't bowing and tripping over themselves just because of some title. Sounds like it could be nice, right? Turin lets out a rueful chuckle. Yeah, he says quietly. It does sound nice. We could just do it, mumbles Sarai. We could just leave. Mum'd be furious, but we could. She can practically hear the way he shakes his head. You know why we can't? Yeah, she murmurs. I know. X. Please tell me you didn't actually say that. No, sighs Ezran. I didn't. I wanted to though. Anya laughs at him. She squints her eyes shut and muffles the sound in her palm, but it echoes through the garden all the same. It's just them this afternoon, as had cleared the vicinity the moment they walked in, and the closest member of his crown guard is Soren, who's standing guard by the garden gates. It's a relatively rare moment of privacy, and they both relish it. Ez probably doesn't even get this much time to himself, but at least with Anya, he has the excuse of wanting to catch up with an old friend. He's determined to make it last. They're talking about King Kasef. He's always been an idiot, and that's being polite. Ez had gone to Neolandia not too long ago in a bid to have him slacken the security at his borders for elves wanting to pass through. He'd said no, in spite of the fact that it's been almost 2 decades since the war ended and there's been no real trouble since. In his head, Ez had sworn at him and called him a slew of words that would have been very inappropriate at the time, but at least Anya shares his sentiments and that makes up for it enough. She picks the end off a jelly tart, pops it neatly into her mouth and hums at the taste, and Ez makes a face. Just bite into it like a normal person, he says, a little incredulously. That's not exactly proper. Proper? Ez snorts loudly, just to make a point. The only proper way to eat a jelly tart is to stuff the whole thing in your mouth. That's what it's for. Oh. Anya's eyes glint mischievously at him, a challenge in her smile. Care to demonstrate, Your Majesty? Gladly, says Ez, seizing one from the plate between them and shoving it whole into his mouth. The jam fills the inside of his cheeks and he almost chokes on the pastry, but Anya hides her laughter in her hands and he decides that it's totally worth it. How many of THEFE do you think I could fire in here? That's disgusting, giggles Anya. Please don't try. I reckon Ali's free. Ez. She rolls her eyes at him, amused and patient, like a real adult with responsibilities and maturity. Ez wishes she wouldn't, sometimes, even when she does agree to run off with a pile of jelly tarts, or sneak out of the castle for Sarai's birthdays at the Wishbone, she's always the one to reel him back in and remind him of his place and title. He swallows hugely, a pout tugging at his lips. You're no fun. You're too much, she returns, smirking. And you're a mess. She licks at her thumb and leans over their little table, swiping deftly at the little bit of jam at the corner of his lips. Ez leans into her without even thinking about it. His cheeks warm under her touch, and not for the first time, he finds himself grateful that the darkness of his skin hides the redness that would otherwise be on his face. Her fingers linger, just for a moment, and then they are gone, and she's sitting back in her chair again, hands folded neatly on the table like they were never near him at all. What are we doing, Ez? She asks quietly. Having tea, says Ez stubbornly, pouring them 2 fresh cups. You know. Like friends. We're not really just friends, are we? Ez has no answer to that. He stares into his teacup for a moment, debating his answer because yes isn't true, and no isn't allowed. His heart aches and flutters within his ribs because he's not sure how to respond at all, especially with Opalai's words fresh in his mind. She's not an option, Your Majesty. You know that. How are things on that front, he asks instead. Anya doesn't meet his eyes. My advisors want me to get married, she murmurs. I have until the end of the month to find an alternative. But, otherwise, she trails off. I can't avoid it forever, as she mutters. I'm running out of time. She is. She's not so young anymore, and if she puts it off any longer, she might not be able to produce an heir at all. Anya's not like him, she doesn't have the luxury of a brother to be her heir presumptive, she has her regent and, that's it. There's no one else appropriate for the throne of Duran, and that puts her entire kingdom in jeopardy should anything ever happen to her. He shakes his head at her. Don't agree on anything yet, he says, something like determination welling in his chest. I have an idea. I just need to talk to Callum first. Okay. She raises an eyebrow at him, looking dubious, looking afraid to even hope, but there's trust in her eyes too, and in the end, she nods. Okay. It's little more than a tentative whisper, but it's enough. For now. Notes. You guys ever write a fic where you spend most of the time going WTF am I doing, BC? That's been me this whole fic so far. Edit. Your Tumblr user at WooCash is a bloody legend and has been doodling some scenes for this fic for funsies, and anyway, please go appreciate his latest pieces, they are beautiful and I'm emo apt it. Chapter 4. Summary. There's something you're not telling us, isn't there? Notes. Oh hi team. Sorry for the delay. I got married last week and the last month has been a mad rush to get everything done and ready for the wedding. We had a lovely day, and your congrats on Tumblr were much appreciated. Heart, you guys are honestly the loveliest readers anyone could ask for. Thanks for your patience. Your regularly scheduled fic will now continue as per usual, laughing smiley. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. 3. Callum and Rayla arrive in the early evening. Ez spots them from the balcony, the bright silver of Rayla's hair unmistakable in the light of the setting sun. It's been months since they were last here, but they haven't changed much, they are still both disgusting and in love, their fingers laced together between them as they tug the horses across the bailey. Callum's in need of a haircut again, and there are tired lines under Rayla's eyes that are visible even from all the way over here, but their smiles are the same. They are still bright and happy to be home, and Ez grins at them as he jogs down the stairs two at a time, leaving Anya in his dust. Are you coming? He calls over his shoulder. Anya only rolls her eyes at him, amused by his childlike eagerness. One of us has to pretend to be dignified. He blows a raspberry at her just to prove that it won't be him. He hurries across the bailey with quiet feet, dodging stable hands and muddy patches in the dirt. He's never been particularly good at sneaking up on Callum, but it's Rayla who catches him first. Her eyes flit towards him, a smirk tugging at the corners of her lips, and she purposefully draws Callum's attention to give Ez the opening he needs, and he lunges. Tackles Callum around the waist. Callum manages a startled yelp, his eyes comically wide as he stumbles. The muddy ground rushes up to meet them, and Ez knows that it's unbecoming and that Opalai would disapprove, but he doesn't care. Callum and Rayla are back and it's hard to contain his excitement. You're home, he cries, forgetting, for a moment, his age and title. Callum sputters for a moment, but in the end, a grin splits his face and ruffles his brother's hair. We're home, he agrees, wiping mud off his chin. Did you miss us or something? Or something, teases Ez, snickering first at him before he turns his smile to Rayla and matches her smirk. How have you been? Well enough, says Rayla. She offers them her hands, looking both exasperated and amused by their antics. Did Sarai get in okay? Course she did, says Ez. She went up to the North Tower, I think. It's like she takes after you or something. Rayla lets out a breath. It's subtle, but Ez knows her well enough now to know that she's been holding that tension since Sarai hurried away. He doesn't blame her at all. He remembers the circumstances of Sarai's birth like it was yesterday. He waves her off, hoping his nonchalance reassures her at least a little before he tugs her into a hug too. Rayla accepts it gratefully, unminding of the mud he gets on her clothes. We've heard some things, she says. The concern in her voice is obvious. Es shakes his head. Everybody hears things he says. Whether or not those things are true is a different story. Are they? Later says Es firmly. He pulls away from her, enjoying the way he towers over both of them now. We can catch up first, can't we? Course we can, chuckles Rayla. Her eyes dart his shoulder, her smile softening as she sidesteps him in favor of greeting Anya. Your Majesty, she says with a curtsy. You don't have to do that, says Anya, a fine blush dusting her cheeks. There are no formalities between friends, princess. Don't call me princess, then. Rayla's lips twitch upwards, a challenge of sorts for Anya, a dare to call her by her name just once, but instead, Anya laughs and curtsies back. Tush, I suppose. One day, snorts Callum. He sidesteps Es too and bows. How do you do, Your Majesty? I'm very well, thank you, she says, curtsying to Callum as well, ever the epitome of propriety. It makes Es sigh because he finds himself wishing once more that she wouldn't. He's not stupid. It's more than just years of ingrained good manners now, when it's painfully clear what the situation is, and when even Callum and Rayla treat her like she's family. It's her way of keeping her distance, of reminding him, and them, that whatever's going on between them can't exist. He shakes his head in the end. Come on, he says, clapping Callum and Rayla's shoulders. There's a halfling teenager somewhere in the castle who's probably hungry for dinner. Let's not keep her waiting. X. The week passes in a blur. Mum and Dad spend it helping with preparations for the ball and festival, leaving Sarai free to wander the castle on her own. They give her odd jobs when they can find her. Dad put her in charge of overseeing table settings and seating when he found her sneaking away with an armload of jelly tarts the other day, but they leave her alone for the most part and, personally, she rather prefers it. She's not so fond of bossing around even the castle staff, and the way they fuss and trip over themselves around her makes her scull. She tries to disappear at every opportunity, but it's hard with Turin always at her heels. It's to keep her out of trouble, he says, but mostly she thinks it's because Uncle Soren gave him very specific orders to not let her out of his sight. She supposes she doesn't mind. If someone's going to tail her, she'd rather it be Turin and not someone older or stuffier. At least Turin knows how to have a little fun on the job, even if she has to coax him into it. So about the festival, she starts one day. They're in the ballroom, and she's counting chairs and tables as Uncle Ez's staff set them up. Turin raises an eyebrow at her. Don't you have to be, here? Not the whole time. Sorry, I pauses in her counting to glance at him from the corner of her eye. Dad's been pretty understanding about it, she adds mildly. I'm going one way or another, but as long as I'm here for all the formal stuff, it doesn't matter. But I'm on duty that night. Then you would be remiss in your duty if you let me sneak out on my own. She smirks at him, mischief dancing in the pale violet of her eyes. Turin scowls at her. Are you trying to get me fired? You won't get fired, says Sarai shortly. When she catches him frowning at her, she shrugs. What? It's true. You'd be more likely to get fired if you knowingly let me sneak out and didn't come with me. You don't seriously think Uncle Soren disapprove of it when your entire job right now is to, quote/unquote, keep me out of trouble, do you? That's not the point, snaps Turin. It comes out uncharacteristically terse, and the complaint spills from his lips before he has the chance to remember to be polite. I have other responsibilities now, sorry, I can't keep sneaking off with you just because you don't want to deal with yours. Sorry, I bristles at him. Don't then, she sneers. At least you actually want your responsibilities. Don't you dare lecture me about mine. For a moment, it looks like he might argue. Honestly, sorry, I wants him to. She is irresponsible and immature and she knows it, and he shouldn't feel uncomfortable for calling her out on it. It's a strange feeling, to want to be scolded. Maybe it's because, for once, it might feel like she doesn't have a title hanging over her head. But he ducks his eyes instead, an embarrassed flush creeping into the light brown of his cheeks. Sorry, he mutters. I forgot myself. That only makes Sarai bristle more. She tempers herself, though. He hasn't done anything wrong. His manners don't make him at fault. Don't apologize, she mumbles at last. I'll clear it with Uncle Soren. And with my mum and dad, even. Okay. Will you come to the festival then? He hesitates, but he nudges her elbow with his in the end, something like a smile gracing his lips. Sure, he says. It'd be kind of mean to leave Lesser in the shop without company anyway. Don't be ridiculous, laughs Sarai. An entire evening without us. During a festival. Turin lets out a snort. She'd probably spend the whole night flirting. No one'd be there to make fun of her. We can't have that. Sarai shakes her head, hiding a chuckle in her fist as she turns her eyes back to the ballroom setup. They don't argue beyond that. X. The day of the festival and ball rolls around quicker than Ez is prepared for it. He'd thought with Anya's help, and with Callum and Rayla's, they might have been able to take their time with it this time around, but in the flurry of activity, that time is lost. It doesn't help that Opalai spends a fair amount of it staring disapproving holes into his back, and he can't even blame her for it because, well, Callum's been back for a week. They still haven't talked about it. They've been busy, he keeps telling himself. There are guests and common folk to cater for, and their needs, right now, are more important than this one conversation. He avoids the topic entirely, sneaking away when Opalai comes looking and changing the subject when someone brings it up. Twice, Rayla touches on it, but he waves her off and directs her attention to whatever antics Sarai's been up to instead. It's cheap, and Sarai probably doesn't appreciate it, but she'd understand if she knew. He gets the feeling sometimes that she knows more than she lets on anyway. Dusk falls before he knows it. The lamps in the city blink into life one by one, and Ezran watches, envious of the simplicity of life outside of the castle. His people are celebrating peace today. Peace that, 10 years ago, seemed impossible, even after the war was done and the treaties were signed. They've come a long way, and his people deserve this. But what his people deserve brings back thoughts of the talk he knows he's supposed to have. You're looking pretty melancholy for someone about to open a ball. Ez blinks, and when he turns, he finds Rayla, wine in one hand, plate of jelly tarts in the other. He grins at her, snatching a tart off the plate in an effort to hide the grimace that crosses his face. Shouldn't you be in the ballroom already? Rayla shrugs at him and sets the plate gently on top of the banister. Shouldn't you? Ez snorts into the jelly tart. I just wanted a minute, he chuckles. Where's Sarai? Begging her father to let her go out later, says Rayla, rolling her eyes. Weird that she's actually asking for permission. You're telling me? Rayla laughs, but Ez isn't fooled. There's reluctance in her eyes, and if it were up to her, Ez is pretty certain that there wouldn't even be an argument. But Sarai's getting older, and she can't shelter her forever. At the very least, Rayla knows to remove herself from that decision so that her daughter can have the room she needs to grow. She shakes her head after a moment and sips delicately at her wine. There's something you're not telling us, isn't there? Ez winces. Of course she would notice. She's Rayla. She's a sister to him by law, and she knows him now just as well as Callum does. It can only mean that Callum's noticed too. Ez. Rayla purses her lips and frowns at him. Whatever it is, you can talk to us. Or at least, Callum, if you don't want to talk about it to me. That's not it, says Ez quickly. I wanted to talk to you together because, well, it concerns you, as well. I just hoped that, maybe if I put it off for long enough, it would have stopped being such a problem. Instead, it just got worse. That tends to be the way of procrastination, chuckles Rayla, in spite of herself. Look. We're here to help. Whatever it is, we'll do what we can. I know you will, says Ez. He grins at her, or tries to, anyway, and offers her his arm. Come on. Let's get this party started, shall we? Rayla grins back. Let's. He turns his back to the city and leads her back into the ballroom without another word. X. You're letting her go, then. It comes out probably a little more sour than she intends, but Callum shrugs it off and presses a patient kiss to Rayla's fingers. She's pretty tonight, her hair in that loose braid she likes to wear on formal occasions, her dress green and embroidered in silver. Even the scowl set into the line of her lips is endearing, and Callum grins, tugging her off his brother's arm so he can address his court. She'll have Turin with her, he promises quietly. They'll probably just go and get lesser and hang around to watch the festivities. She'll be okay. Rayla grimaces, obviously displeased, but she knows he's right. He can see it on her face, along with the frustration at herself for being so needlessly overprotective. She takes a breath. Where is she now? Gone to tell Turin, probably, says Callum with a shrug. She promised she'd be here for all the formalities. We can only hold her to it. When Rayla says nothing, he squeezes her fingers and tugs her close. Did you talk to Ez? That snaps her out of it. The irritated little frown on her face is replaced by something closer to concern as she cranes her neck over the crowd to watch Ez address his court from the dais, her eyes narrowed like she's waiting for something, some clue to whatever's been on his mind. Callum thinks he knows, but it's always hard to tell with Ez. He's too good at pretending to be a cheerful young king in a time of peace, but it was silly of him to think he could keep his emotions truly hidden from the two of them. Maybe the rumors are true, then he muses. He wouldn't keep an arranged marriage from you, says Rayla. He wouldn't agree to one without your input. Yeah, but if his advisors are forcing his hand. His advisors come second to you. Rayla sets her jaw, brow furrowed thoughtfully as she sips at her wine. He said he wanted to talk to both of us. It's something else. X. Uncle Ez's address is quick this year, but the way her parents are frowning at him from across the ballroom piques Sarai's interest more than she wants to admit. They mutter to themselves the whole time, and Aunt Anya, who's usually happy to gossip with them, is seated primly at her table hiding a frown behind a glass of wine. When Uncle Ez closes his speech, he hops off the dais looking nervous, she thinks, and just as Turin tugs at her elbow, she shakes her head. Turin stares at her. Do you want to go or what? Sarai pauses. Not yet, she mutters. You go. I'll meet you down in the stables. But Turin hesitates. Uncle Soren said. Yeah, once we leave, says Sarai. We haven't left yet. I don't need protection to get from here to the stables. I need to change anyway. Dunno that you really want to stick around for that. She smirks at him and the blush that heats his face. Go. I won't be long. Turin purses his lips uncertainly, but he nods in the end. He turns on his heel, his armor clanking lightly as he pushes his way through the crowd and to the back of the ballroom, and Sarai waits until he's disappeared through the double doors before she ducks into the nearest alcove and draws an invisibility rune into the air. When she peers at Mum and Dad again from behind the shade of her magic, Uncle Ez is beckoning them, Opalai, and Aunt Anya into the room behind the dais. Her curiosity gets the better of her, and Sarai eases her way through the crowd, careful not to brush against anyone and blow her cover. It's not the first time she's tried to eavesdrop on proceedings from within that room, and she's familiar enough with the castle to know exactly where she has to go. There's a high window in there that's accessible to her from the balcony at the head of the ballroom, and she hitches her skirts up as she goes, careful not to fall as she climbs over the railing and onto the vine. She seats herself against the sill, bracing her back against the uneven stones. Uncle Ez's voice is muffled from here, but it's clear enough for her to hear nonetheless. There's a conversation I've been avoiding, he says quietly. Even from here, I can see the way Opalai arches an stunned eyebrow. Have you come to a decision then, Your Majesty? Yes, says Uncle Ez firmly, but he's looking at Mum and Dad as he answers. Catullus needs an heir. Duran needs one too, and we can't keep pretending things will work themselves out as is. What we need is a compromise, and I think I have a solution, but I need your help. Dad blinks at him, like he's surprised Uncle Ez needs to even ask. Of course, he says. Whatever you need, Ez. Just tell us what you want and we'll do it. Uncle Ez takes a breath. I need you to be king. I'm abdicating my claim to the throne of Catullus. Notes. Hey Aislinn, on Discord you told me you thought you knew what was gonna happen. Were you right? Chapter 5. Summary. This would make her queen, one day, Ezran. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. 4. Sarai forgets how to breathe. For a moment, she's not even sure that she heard correctly. Uncle Ez can't abdicate. He wouldn't abdicate. He cares about his people too much, and knows his duty to them too well. She must have misunderstood. He has to be joking. But there's not a trace of humor in the grim line of his lips, and his eyes have never been harder and more determined. What, manages Opalai at last. She stares at him, eyes wide, jaw unhinged, like she's waiting for a punchline too. Why, Your Majesty? He cuts her off. It makes sense, doesn't it, he says, although there's a tremor in his voice that makes it sound as if he's still trying to convince himself of it. Catullus needs a king that can provide it with a queen and an heir. Callum has both. If I step down, then Anya has the option too. No, says Aunt Anya weakly. She shakes her head, her face pale in the torchlight. Ezran. No, I can't let you do this. My own abdication isn't up to you. No, snaps Aunt Anya again. Her voice is harder this time, and there's a fury in her eyes that makes even sorry I want to look away. Catullus needs its king, Ezran. They need you. You can't turn your back on them like this. I'm not turning my back on anyone, scowls Uncle Ez. He gestures vaguely at Dad. They'll be in good hands. Better hands, even. It's our best option, Anya, and Ez. That's Dad. Sorry, I's never seen him so stumped by a concept, and he and Mum look at a loss. They've never looked like that before. They've faced 1,000,001 problems in their duties between elves and humans, and there's always a solution, but right now, they are staring at Uncle Ez like they've both punched in the gut. Ez, I can't. Uncle Ez swallows. Callum. Please understand. I can't keep doing this to myself, or to Anya. It's the only way. Dad shakes his head. I can't, as he says hoarsely. I'm not appropriate. It's fine that I'm a last resort, but that's all I'm supposed to be. I'm only royalty by Mom's marriage to Dad, I don't share Dad's bloodline. I can't be king. With respect, Your Majesty, adds Opalai, there are other implications that you haven't considered. Imagine how it might look to the other kingdoms if Prince Callum, the most powerful mage in the world, took the throne. It would look like a show of power. It would make Catullus look like a threat. But Callum would never. I know I wouldn't, says Dad, but my intentions don't matter. We're on good terms with Livanna and Farida, and Cusf, well, if we don't bother him, he doesn't bother us. But if I became king, all of that might change. We can't afford that. It's not even just that, says Mum at last. She clears her throat, and reworks her face into a frown that looks thoughtful and concerned and terrified all at once. I'm an elf, Ez. Catullus has come a long way, but I don't know that your people are ready for an elven queen. And sorry I sucks in a gasp. It barely makes it past her throat because she hadn't even thought about it. This whole time, she'd been so caught up with the ludicrous idea of Uncle Ez not being king that she hadn't even considered what it would mean for her. What about sorry I? Uncle Ez scowls at them. All of them. She's always been a halfling princess, and as is, she's already second in line for the throne. All this does is move her up the chain slightly. She doesn't want this, snaps Mum. It's fine now because she's only second in line under the assumption that you don't produce an heir. Do you even understand what you're asking her to do? This would make her queen, one day, Ezran. Sorry, I shakes her head, wordless. Afraid. Her palms feel slick with sweat. Her fingers are numb. There's a hum in her ears that makes it hard to hear anything else, and her heart is hammering against her ribcage so quickly that, for a moment, she thinks it might fail. It doesn't matter. She's heard enough. She scrambles off the ledge with shaking hands and unsteady feet, climbs back onto the balcony, unminding of the way her skirt catches against the vines. When she pushes her way back into the ballroom, she almost balks because suddenly there are too many people, watching her with curious eyes and disapproving frowns. She shoves past them, ignoring the way they bow and curtsy, wishing they wouldn't, wishing they'd stop, and wondering vaguely when exactly her invisibility spell had worn off. She stumbles through the ballroom, clumsy and faint and unable to breathe, and then she's running, afraid to look back. X. You can't do this to her, Ez. Rayla's voice comes out like a plea, but that's what it is, when it comes down to it. She shakes her head at him, her fists closed by her sides. Your people are still getting used to me. They won't accept me as their queen. They won't accept her if she has to take the throne. She already hates the pomp and circumstance, you can't ask her to be anything more. I'm not asking her, says Es, glancing away, his eyes guilty. When he looks up again, he's looking at Callum. I'm asking you. Please, Callum. You are so lucky you got the chance to marry for love. I just want a chance to do the same. He glances at Anya then, and for the first time, even she doesn't have it in her to argue. She stares at her shoes, the conflict clear on her face, because she knows what she wants and that it's not allowed, and that this really is their only chance. But gods, it's so complicated, and there are so many reasons Callum shouldn't take Ez's place on the Catolan throne, and yet. Callum tears his eyes away from them. He is lucky. He's lucky that Ez had the foresight to arrange his marriage to Rayla before anyone else had the chance to try for his hand. He's lucky that Ez knew, before he did, even, how in love with her he'd been all those years ago. How can he do anything else? How can he knowingly obstruct his brother's only chance at happiness, true happiness, after everything he's done for him and his family? Ez, he begins tiredly. He slumps onto the bench against the wall, his hands over his eyes. Callum, he hears Rayla say, her voice hoarse and terrified. Callum, no, we can't. He shakes his head at her. She's right, as he murmurs. There are so many reasons we can't do this, but he huffs. There's gotta be something else. Another option. Anything. There isn't, mutters Ez. I've thought about this a lot, okay. Believe me. We've had years to mull this over and, it's this, or we agree to marry people we've never even met. At least this way, I know Catullus is in safe hands. Please. Callum lets out a sigh. He says nothing for a while. He thinks it might be because he's afraid of his own answer, and of what it might do to his brother, or to his daughter. Let me think about it, he murmurs at last. Give us a couple of months. I don't have that long, whispers Anya. She doesn't look at any of them as she says it, but there's bitterness there, a frustration at herself, and at the complexity of the situation. Callum can see it dancing like fire in the amber of her eyes. Then. He glances at Rayla, noting the way she won't look at him either. We need time to talk about this. Okay. 1 month, that's all I'm asking. Then we'll make a decision. Opalai starts forward, a protest on her tongue, but Callum shakes his head at her. I haven't agreed, he says sharply. 1 month. Okay. Silence falls between them. For the longest time, no one says anything, until Opalai nods and bows to all of them. Of course, Your Highness, she grumbles. 1 month. Ez nods too, in the end. 1 month, he breathes. We can live with that. X. It's fine. It's a whisper, a poor attempt at settling her nerves and slowing her heart, but an attempt nonetheless. Sorry, I swallows, the heels of her hands pressed into her eyes like the pressure might help her remember how to breathe as she paces and trips and paces some more. The halls in the south wing are empty, which is just as well. She can't be seen like this. She's better than this, she just needs a minute. Just a minute to calm down, and to think. But Mum's words echo loudly in her ears and they make her want to throw up. This would make her queen, one day, Ezran. God's croaks, sorry I. Moon and stars, get a hold of yourself, sorry I, it's fine. It's not fine, and there's no way to pretend that it is. She can't be queen. She barely has it in her to behave like a princess. People bow to her and wait on her, and already, she can't stand it, but to be first in line for the throne, to have that hanging over her for the rest of her life, and to be expected to rule. Breathe, she hisses to herself. Breathe. Come on. It's fine. You're fine. If this is fine, I'd hate to see what your version of upset is. Sorry, I yelps. She draws a blade from her back, the one that Mum had given her ages ago, out of instinct, but it's only Uncle Soren, leaning lazily against the far wall with a half-empty bag of popped corn in hand. Uncle Soren, she manages, lowering her blade. What are you doing here? I could ask the same of you. He smirks at her and shoves a handful of food past his lips. Usually, you'd be long gone by now, and there's no way you'd let me catch you in the act. You're losing your touch. Sorry, I scowls at him. I'm going now, she snaps. I needed a minute. Oh. He pushes himself off the wall and proffers the bag at her. To do what? I hesitates. For a second, she's furious. At him for looking so smug. At herself for allowing herself to be caught like this, maybe. She's not sure. But there's something sort of sympathetic in his eyes. Something that knows something's wrong and that genuinely wants to help. He's always been pretty lax around her. More understanding than Mum sometimes, for sure. I heard she cuts herself off, unsure why she'd started to begin with. But Uncle Soren's different. He's just as cheeky as her when he wants to be, and there's a sort of trust there that she can't explain. She swallows again. I overheard some stuff she murmurs at last. Millimeter, yeah, drawls Uncle Soren, tossing another piece of popped corn into his mouth. And water is wet. Go on. Sorry, I takes a breath. Uncle es, she mutters. He wants to, she snaps her mouth shut, afraid of the reality of it. Uncle Soren's lips twitch upwards into a grim sort of smile, and it occurs to Sorry I far too late that he already knows. Of course he knows. Uncle Es would never have told him, but as head of his crown guard, and as a close personal friend who's with him almost all day every day, of course he would figure it out on his own. Is all he says. He frowns at his paper bag thoughtfully and says nothing for a while. Then he coughs. What are you going to do about it, then? I stares at her feet. I don't know, she says quietly. Her voice cracks under the emotional strain, but she takes another breath, a long, shuddering inhale that swallows the exhale, to keep herself in check. I dunno, Uncle Soren. I can't be here, but I don't know where else to. He snorts at her. You're so like your mom, he chuckles, emptying the bag into his mouth. You know, it's been ages since you've gone to visit Claudia. If, theoretically, you just turned up, I don't think she'd mind. Sorry, I blinks. When she glances up, Uncle Soren is shrugging at her and scrunching the bag in his fist. Go, he says. Take Turin with you. Tell Claudes I said hi. Go, he says again. I can only hold your mom up for so long. If I were you, I'd get out of here while I still had the chance. He winks at her, his smile kinder and more understanding than she's ever seen it, and then he turns, leaving Sorry I alone in the hall with her heart pounding loudly in her ears. She makes a run for the stables. Turin's already there with Colibri all saddled and ready to go, and he frowns at her as she leaps over the doorway. Too late, she realizes that she's still in her formal wear, and that she'd forgotten to get changed in the rush. There's straw caught in her skirt, and mud in the hem where she'd forgotten to hitch it up and over her shoes. There's hair falling out of the braid Mum had done up for her earlier this evening, and the anguish is certainly clear on her face, but she doesn't care. She just wants to go. There's been a change of plans, she declares, willing her voice to be steady. Turin stares at her. There's been a what, now? Sorry, I ignores him and vaults deftly onto Colibri's back. We're not going to the festival. Turin's still staring, and he stumbles after her, even as she holds a hand out to him to help him into the saddle behind her. Where are we going, then? Sorry, I clicks her tongue, easing her stallion out of the stables and out of the postern gate. She glances up at the castle, and for a moment she hesitates, for once afraid of the consequences that might follow. But Mum's words are still there in her mind, like a ghost haunting her of a future yet to come. This would make her queen, one day, Ezran. She steels herself, Colibri's reins tight around her fists. We're leaving, she says shortly. We're taking Lesser to Lantha. Notes. God, I hope you guys are enjoying this because I am so nervous about literally everything in this fic. Chapter 6. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. V. Opalai excuses herself first. Then Anya because she's not sure what else there is to say. Ez follows her not too long afterwards, his head bowed in shame for asking so much of his brother and sister-in-law, and the whole time, Callum stares past his hands at a loss. Rayla stays too, of course. This is heavy on her shoulders too, and Callum suspects that she's not sure how they are supposed to go on knowing now what's at stake. There's music in the background, the muffled hum of the ball beyond the doors, something ludicrously light compared to the atmosphere in the room, until, at last, Rayla takes a shuddering breath. What are we going to do? Callum says nothing for a while. There's nothing in his mind right now. He's never been so stumped. He clears his throat. Hopefully nothing, he croaks at last. This is crazy. That's the understatement of the century, mutters Rayla. Callum snorts mirthlessly and runs his hands over his face. You're telling me? He huffs and looks to his wife at last, searching her face for an answer he knows she doesn't have. We can't let them do this. I can't be king, Rayla, but after everything Ez has done for us. Rayla scowls at him. You're not seriously thinking. I don't know what I'm thinking, he snaps. I don't want this. I want to go home and teach Sari Irun magic in my study. I want to sit by the river with you and watch the stars. I don't want this, but, he groans. Those things are only possible because Ez had the foresight to arrange our marriage before anyone could suggest anything else. He has the chance now for something like that with Anya. How can I stand in their way? You're not standing in their way, snarls Rayla. There's something else. There has to be, because moon and stars help me. I won't let you do this to Sarai. Think of her, Callum. Think of what you'd be asking her to do. She lets out a frustrated sigh and throws her head back, cursing the sky and everything in it for putting them in this situation. Please don't do this to her, she says at last, all but begging for him to listen. She hates all of this. Rayla gestures vaguely around the room. Already. Don't do this. I'm not doing anything, grumbles Callum. I said we would think about it. We've got a month. Do you really think we can come up with a better solution in a month, hisses Rayla. Ez has had years. And now he has us, says Callum resolutely. He gives her a hard stare, lips pressed thin, because Rayla must know he hates this as much as she does, and it's unfair of her to act like he wants it in the least. We'll figure something out. Something that doesn't involve me being king. Rayla snorts skeptically. Will we? We always do, says Callum. We will. When he looks at her this time, there's anguish in his face, and the ice in Rayla's eyes falters. We have to. X. The crowd parts for Anya like fabric splitting at the seams, and if anyone notices the turned down corners of her lips, they are too polite to say. She strides through the ballroom, head held high, regal as always, and if Ez were anyone else, he might have thought she just needed some air. He's not anyone else though. He knows her too well to miss the hardness of her face and the lack of her usual grace. She's furious. Anya, he tries, once they're out of the ballroom and in the relative quiet of the entrance hall. Anya, wait. She scowls at him. For what? She asks coolly. For you to make the stupidest mistake of your life. For your brother to decide what to do for you. Ez purses his lips. He looks away. You're angry at me. You think, snaps Anya. The way her voice pitches upwards in her anger makes Ez flinch. He's privy to more of her emotion than most, but he's never seen her so mad. How could you do this? She demands. You could have mentioned it in a letter, or over tea, or something, and instead. You would have stopped me. I'm trying to stop you now. Hisses Anya. She strides towards him, seething and angrier than he's ever seen her, fists balled at her sides. How could you even think of stepping down because of me? How could you think this is what I want in the least? Your people deserve better than this from you. Nothing's been decided yet, Snap says, frustrated, tired, his own anger hot and irrational in his throat. Callum said a month. Of inaction, seethes Anya. Of waiting around for your brother to decide what happens to both our kingdoms, Ezran. Did you even consider that? Yes, hisses Ez, I did. If he says yes, they'll be in good hands, and if he says no, nothing changes. We move on. We agree to other arrangements. What's the damn problem? The problem, Ezran, is that you're king, not him. Anya jabs a finger into his chest, amber eyes welling with frustrated tears. You're putting your entire kingdom's relationships with Evenir and Neolandia and Delbar at risk for something so stupid. This isn't stupid, Skull says. I made a decision. I'm trying something else. What have you done other than stall? You don't get to make this about me. It is about you. It's always been about you, don't you get it? In his anger, his frustration, his desperation, Ez forgets himself. He forgets they're in the entrance hall. He forgets the stakes, and the propriety, and the fact that there's a ballroom full of guests down the hall. He kisses her. He's never kissed her before. They've never let themselves get so far. He'd always thought that, if they ever got around to it, it would be sweeter, softer, something secret that they could treasure in the quiet evenings he was here and she was in Duran. Instead, it's angry, and tense, and heartbreaking, full of the longing they've never been allowed to admit. The worst part is that she kisses him back, and the rules between them have never felt so pointless. The truth is there. It's tangible. It's in her lips and on his, and yet. Anya yanks herself away, huffing and red and angrier still, but this time, at herself. We can't do this. Tell me you don't care, then says Ez. Tell me that meant nothing to you. Anya draws a shuddering breath. She swallows. She steps back. I can't, she whispers. Then she turns and stalks away, leaving Ez standing breathless and alone in the hall. X. It takes Turin an entire half-minute to process the sentence, and by the time he remembers to close his mouth, Sorry I is shaking Colibri's reins and urging him into a canter. The sudden burst of speed makes him wobble dangerously in the saddle, and he lurches forward and clings tightly to the small of her waist. Leaving, he manages at last. What the hell do you mean by we're leaving? It's exactly what it sounds like, says Sorry I, digging her heels into Colibri's sides. We're leaving. No point sticking around here anymore. Turin swears, her voice wavers as she says it, but she doesn't look at him and steers her stallion towards the city proper. The panic settles in his gut too late. Whoa, Sorry I. He tries to take the reins off her, but she dodges his hands and urges Colibri faster still. Sorry I can't be here right now, snaps Sorry I at last. Her voice cracks. She sniffles. I can't, Turin. We have to go. At least tell me what happened then. Sorry I hesitates. Then she shakes her head. It doesn't matter, she grumbles. Just, Uncle Soren told me to take you with me. You're under orders now. That's all you need to know. That's not an answer. Turin seizes the reins from her at last and tugs Colibri to a stop on the bridge just outside the castle walls. The stallion nickers, irritated, but it's long enough an opportunity for Turin to scramble off him, wide-eyed and a little afraid. Sorry I's always been impulsive, but never like this, and she's upset enough that Turin almost doesn't doubt her. Something's happened. Something serious. But this. Sorry I, he tries again, studying her face in the lantern light. Talk to me. Please. What happened? For what it's worth, Sorry I doesn't just immediately leave, and he'd half expected her to, in her state, but she doesn't look at him either, and it makes trying to get a read on her harder than it already is. Her eyes flit to the people around them, couples mostly, and young families looking at the castle all lit up against the night sky. It's the one place she doesn't look, even as she sets her jaw and strengthens her resolve. The realization settles like a stone in Turin's gut. You're running away. The accusation makes Sorry I scowl, but the scariest part is that she doesn't deny it. Are you coming? Turin stares at her, slack-jawed and speechless. If you don't want to come, fine, she snaps, but I'm taking Lesser to Lantha and you can't stop me. I'm not, Turin takes a breath. She's wound up and irrational, and this is a very public place to have a discussion like this. Sorry I's well known enough to the people that being overheard won't bode well for anyone. He chooses his next words carefully because this is already insane, and he's afraid of what she might do next. I'm not trying to stop you, he says at last. I need to know what's going on, Sorry I. You're scaring me. I can't talk about it right now, okay, says Sorry I, her voice breaking at last. I just want to go. Are you coming? There's a pause. Turin glances at the castle behind her, knowing he has responsibilities there, and duties he can't just walk away from. His parents would be furious if he just disappeared, but even more than that, Aunt Rayla would murder him. Uncle Callum wouldn't even try to stop her, and Uncle Soren would never trust him to be a crown guard again. But Sorry I's the crown too, isn't she? She's upset, and she's scared, and she's doing something so stupid, but most importantly, she's his friend. There's only ever one answer when it comes to her, and there's more than just duty attached to it. He steals his nerve. Yeah, he says at last. Of course. It takes the rest of the ride for Sorry I to fix her composure, but by the time the wishbone comes into view, she thinks she's got a good enough handle on it to at least avoid any questions from Lesser. She's doodling on the counter when they finally pull up at the shop, and Sorry I slides out of Colibri's saddle without a word to Turin before Shoulders open the door. The ring of the little doorbell is lost amid the sounds of the festival, but Lesser looks up and grins all the same. Time to get the party started. Sorry I almost flinches. Lesser's too happy, too excited, and all Sorry I can think about is the weight of conversation she'd overheard in the castle. No, she says, forcing her voice to keep steady. There's been a change of plans. We're going to Lantha. Lesser stares at her. Excuse me. Pack a bag, says Sorry I. We gotta get going now while everyone's distracted. At that, Lesser actually laughs. Well, she says, waving a hand. You're so funny, Sorry I. Come on, there's a stand on the other side of town with moonberry flavored spun sugar that I'm dying to try. What are you doing? Packing, says Sorry I shortly, snatching Lesser's pack off the floor from behind the counter. Let's go. But do you want to go to Lantha to learn magic or not? Wait, you're being serious. Sorry I gives her a look. She spots Turin giving Colibri and their family horse, Solaris, a couple of carrots through the window and wonders if he's taking the initiative to saddle her up too. Colibri's strong, but not strong enough to take all three of them, and certainly not with Pax and Turin's armor. Sorry I cleared it with everyone already. Sorry I lies. My mum and dad'll take care of your mum and dad, and Uncle Soren already gave Turin the order to come with him being a crown guard and me being the crown and all. She tries not to grimace at the way crown sounds so heavy on her tongue. Let's get going. Lesser pauses. Sorry I's heart skips beats while she studies her because for a very real moment, it feels like Lesser might call her bluff, but the idea of learning magic is too exciting for her, and her face splits into a grin so wide, it looks like it must hurt. Really? Yes, says Sorry I, smiling too but out of relief. Let's go. It only takes them 10 minutes to pack. Just some extra clothes, some snacks, a pouch of silver and a second pack for Turin, and when they get outside, they find Colibri and Solaris all saddled up and ready to go. Oh, holy heck, this is real, breathes Lesser. She grins at her brother who offers her a twitch of his lips back before he rounds on Sorry I. Are you sure about this? He asks quietly, while Lesser mounts up and hooks her pack over the horn of Solaris' saddle. Sorry I presses her lips together. Her stomach gurgles with uncertainty, but she forces herself to look up at the castle at last, and that alone strengthens her resolve. Yeah, she mutters, climbing onto Colibri. Let's go. Notes. Yeah, it's been 2 years, don't hurt me. Chapter 7. Chapter text. 6. Dawn breaks. Ezran has barely slept. Their meeting about his abdication had never formally adjourned, but there was nothing else to be said by the time Opalai left, and when Anya had too. It is about you. It's always been about you, don't you get it? Ez groans. It's been hours and he still can't believe that really happened. He and Anya have had their disagreements in the past, but they've never fought like that, and then he'd kissed her and... Had he really? Is he absolutely certain that hadn't been a dream? He certainly has dreamt of it, and for years, too, and he'd replayed it so often in his mind overnight that it feels like that's all it was, but the ghost of her lips against his is real. The way she'd kissed him back, just as urgent, just as desperate to be free of their titles and their responsibilities for even just a second, that was real. And years of yearning for her and of keeping it all so close to his chest because she's the one thing he can't have, that's all real too, and he knows because it hurts more than he ever thought it would. Does it hurt her, too? Had that kiss been one brief moment of relief for her, just as it was for him? Ez rubs a hand over his face and sits up in bed. It's quiet this morning. The ball had gone on for a while last night, and the festival had gone on later still. There's a solid chance most of the visiting nobility is hungover or, at the very least, still asleep. He wonders, dimly, if Anya might be too, or if she'd been up all night like he'd been, and if... Knock 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 knock. Ez blinks. The sun's still barely over the horizon and he'd been careful to make sure he had no meetings today, so he knows it can't be Opalai. Some part of him dares to hope it might be Callum with a decision already, or Anya, wanting to talk about last night, but both of those seem unlikely. He shrugs on a robe and crosses the room to open the door. Rayla. Rayla huffs at him. Have you seen Sarai? Ez stares. No. She huffs once more. She's not in her room this morning. You didn't see her at all last night? No, says Ez. In all fairness, he hadn't really seen anyone since Anya left him standing in the hall. He'd come straight up here to watch the lights in the city and to agonize over his poor decision-making. I thought you said Callum let her hang out at the festival last night. Is it possible she's still out? Rayla gives him a look. I wouldn't think she would still be out past dawn. Oh. Right. Ez draws a breath and keeps his eyes on the floor to avoid catching her eye. He has a feeling this isn't just about Sarai. Look, he says at last. Rayla. She's probably okay. She knows this city like the back of her hand and she can handle herself just fine. You made sure of that, remember? Plus, she's got Turin and Lesser with her. She probably just spent the night at theirs. You're sure you haven't seen her? Positive, says Ez patiently. He purses his lips. Are you okay? Rayla bristles at him and massages her temples with a sigh. Could be better, she mutters snippily. My daughter could not be missing and we could not have your abdication hanging over our heads, but you know. Otherwise, I'm dandy. Ez winces. She's mad too. Of course. He says, staring down at his bare feet. Sorry, he mumbles without looking at her. I don't really know what to say beyond that. A pause stretches between them. There's the sound of movement down the hall. The shift change, Ez thinks. Soren'll be around too, in a little bit, in spite of the fact that Ez had very adamantly tried to give him the day off. Rayla relents at last. Sorry, she mumbles guiltily, her eyes softening at last. There's a lot going on right now. I shouldn't have taken out on you. I'm just. It's okay, says Ez, honestly just relieved she's not glaring at him anymore. If there's one thing Rayla's perfected over the years of parenting Sarai, it's the frown of a disapproving mother. He steps back to let her in and pulls his father's desk chair, his own, he remembers, nearly 2 decades, too late, and motions for her to take a seat. She does, and he sits himself on the edge of the bed and offers her a wan smile. Do you want some tea or something? I can have. What are you thinking, Ez? Blurts Rayla. Years ago, when we were taking ZYM home to his mum, you turned around halfway through our journey to take your dad's place on the throne and you were 10. How can you be considering abdicating now? Ez wrinkles his nose. I thought. And to ask Callum to. He would for you, cuts Ez shortly. Wouldn't he? Ez shakes his head, already tired of this conversation. It's that simple, Rayla, he says. In another life, if things were different and he couldn't be with you because he was royal and you weren't, he wouldn't even think about it. This is different, Ezran. Ez scowls at that. Why, he demands. Why is it so different? How come everyone else gets to be in love and he stops there? It's not news to him. It's not some grand realization or anything. Ezran's known about the extent of his own feelings for years now, but he'd admitted that he wanted to marry for love last night, but admitting to the unfairness of his circumstance is something else. It feels so shallow to complain when he was born into royalty, but the truth of it is that he's no freer than anyone else. I thought you and Callum would understand, he mutters. Ez, we do. Do you? Demands Ez. Do you actually? Do you have any idea what it's like to be handed everything you don't want and not be allowed the one thing that you do? To watch you, and everyone around me find the love of their lives, knowing that he cuts himself off again and blinks at the floor, his heart clenching painfully in his chest. I can't do it anymore, Rayla, he whispers. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine. And I can't marry someone that isn't her when I know. He trails off, but Rayla says nothing for a while. She stares, lips pursed, at the floor, with guilt stirring in the lilac of her eyes, and Ezran knows then that she really does understand. I'm sorry, she mumbles at last. I get it. I do. I don't know. He snorts ruefully. Welcome to my life, he mutters, falling backwards back into bed. I don't know what else to do, he says. Abdicating is the only thing I can do. Callum's my heir presumptive anyway, and he's well liked enough by the council and the city that he could be king. And I. Rayla breathes out. You'd be free. They lapse into silence. Ez stares up at the canopy of his bed and tries to settle the ache in his chest and the roll of his gut. There has to be something else, says Rayla finally. Okay. You've got me and Callum now, and she sighs. I'm sorry, Ezran, we can't. I can't agree to this, knowing what it would mean for Sarai, not when she hates all of this already. We'd be trapping her just the same, and I can't let you do that to her. I know, says Ez. I hoped. We'll find something else, says Rayla firmly. We will. Callum's in the library now, and you can. I don't know. Take the day off or something. You've been thinking it over for years, and maybe that's why you think you can't find any other solution. You need a break. A fresh set of eyes to look over all the laws and the documents and stuff. Callum and I will find you another way out of this. Ezran snorts skeptically. And if you can't? Rayla grimaces. Just hang in there a little longer, okay? We'll cross that bridge if we get to it. The rest of the castle stirs as the sun climbs higher in the sky, but Callum's been up for hours now and he's getting tired of all the dead ends. The castle librarian's been giving him disapproving looks since he got in this morning and started pulling volumes upon volumes of marriage law off the shelves, but every tome, every scroll, every document he's looked at has come back the same. Abdication. Ruling monarchs wanting to marry other ruling monarchs is relatively rare to begin with. Most are married off before they become king or queen, and to nobility that would be beneficial to their own kingdoms, not to people they openly admit that they love. Even his mother's marriage to King Harrow had been arranged, they'd just been lucky enough to have been in love already, and his own marriage to Rayla was orchestrated by Ez under the guise of its political advantages. Other than those, King Farid III of Evenir abdicated to be with King Helios of Delbar 150 years ago. Queen Lydia of Neolandia abdicated to be King John of Catullus 200 years before that, paving the way for Kasef's family line to ascend to the throne. And now, King Ezran. Callum snaps the book shut. It's an old book, all worn leather and dusty pages, detailing the marriages of the royal families of Catullus since the orphan queen right down to Ezran himself. His own name is already in here, courtesy of his mom's marriage to his stepdad, and Rayla's and Sarai's are too, by extension. He shudders at the thought of the word king being written next to his name, and it's a real enough possibility that he can't look at his family tree anymore without thinking about what this book might say a month from now. Your Highness. Callum starts. It's a lot brighter than he remembers it being, and the candle he'd lit at the edge of the desk has burnt itself out. The gold-embossed letters of the next book in his pile, Notable Marriages of Durranian Nobility, shine in the late morning sun. Eleni, he greets, looking up. Eleni twitches her lips at him. There are wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, and the greys in her red-brown hair are more obvious than they were the last time he saw her. She's not active as a member of the Crown Guard anymore, she serves under Soren these days, and helps him manage the standing army in the city, but her armor is still in good nick. She bows. My apologies for interrupting you. Stop that, snorts Callum, waving her off. Friends don't bow to friends, remember. Right. Eleni chuckles tiredly. Sorry. I just wondered if you'd seen Turin or Lesser this morning. Turin was on duty last night, but I figured he and Sarai went off to the festival together, which, I suppose, still counts as on duty, but you know. She snorts. It's just. Lesser's not at home either. Callum stares at her. That's not like her. No, says Eleni. It's not. It's probably nothing, but it's a little concerning is all. You haven't seen Sarai at all? No, Your Highness, says Eleni. Her Highness, sorry, Rayla said she wasn't in her room this morning, which was interesting because she seemed to be under the impression that she might have been staying at ours, only our place has been locked up since last night. Lesser's bed hasn't even been slept in and there's panic growing in her voice. Callum recognizes it as the same kind of panic that strains Rayla's when Sarai's done something she shouldn't have. He holds up his hands. Alas isn't back yet from his latest trip, is he? No, Your Highness, he's not due back for a couple more days. Callum frowns. The kids have never been particularly irresponsible, and if something had happened during the festival last night, they would know, even if they had been distracted by the political nightmare at hand. Okay, He grimaces at his pile of books and makes a note to apologize to the librarian. The research will have to wait. They're probably okay, he says, trying to appease the nerves he knows are gnawing at Eleni's mind. I'll ask around and see if anyone else has seen them. Eleni breathes out her relief. Thank you, she says. Sorry. I know you're busy. Don't, chuckles Callum. Believe me, I get it. Sarai gets up to plenty of mischief on her own, but with your two, they're a handful when they're all together, for sure, snorts Eleni. Thank you regardless. I'll ask around myself. Let you know if I hear anything. Same, says Callum, grinning, and pleased to not be thinking about Ezran's potential abdication for the first time since last night. Try not to worry too much, okay? I'm sure they're fine. They can't have gone far. Are we going or not? Hold on, I'm just trying to, Solaris, come on, there'll be more carrots when we get to the next village. Please. Lesser groans, irritated, and tugs a little harder at Solaris' reins. Sarai rolls her eyes. They'd spent the evening at Mum and Dad's cottage so she could change and pack a bag together, but the morning has been slow. Solaris is Lesser and Turin's dad's horse, and she's not fond of water, much less the river they are trying to cross. The next village isn't even that far away, but at this rate, they won't get in till tonight. Lesser whines Sarai. Come on, if we don't get a move on, we won't get to Lantha at all. You try getting her to cross the river, snaps Lesser. She turns to her brother. You could help. You said you wanted to ride on your own, says Turin pointedly, lips curled in half smirk on Sarai's side of the river. Lesser scowls at them. Solaris, I swear to the sun, the moon, and every primal source besides that I will trade you for a better horse when we get into the next village. Let's go. Solaris brays irritably, but Lesser gives her one last, insistent tug. The mare's knees buckle a little as Lesser leads her across the river, water rising to her knees before, at long last, they join Sarai, Turin, and Colibri on the other side. Was that so hard, grumbles Lesser, and Sarai and Turin hide their laughter in their hands as they start on the trail once more. How much further, anyway, she asks Sarai. Sarai hums. We've been riding for, what, a couple of hours now, she muses out loud. We're making good time, not counting all that. If we keep going at the rate that we're going, we might be at Aunt Ellis village before dusk. Your Aunt Ellis village, asks Turin. The one near the moon nexus. That's the one, says Sarai, urging Colibri onwards. Maybe we should get you a horse while we're there. Give us the option to leave Lesser the next time she can't get Solaris to get a move on. Lesser scowls at them both. If you two wanted to elope, you should have just said so, she sneers. Sarai flushes at that. She pretends not to see the flush on Turin's face too. Let's just get going, she says. It's a long way to Lantha yet. The faster we move, the better.